The Israeli government has been remarkably helpful in this. I want to thank them, thank our Israeli partners, and all the folks particularly who are working hand in hand with their American friends here at the CMCC. And number two, I want to say that there is this weird attitude I've sensed in the American media and the Western media where there's almost this desire to root for failure, that every time something bad happens, that every time that there's an act of violence, there's this inclination to say, oh, this is the end of the ceasefire, this is the end of the peace plan. It's not the end. It is, in fact, exactly how this is going to happen when you have people who hate each other, who have been fighting against each other for a very long time. We are doing very well. We are in a very good place. And look, our warning to Hamas is very straightforward. The terms of the 20-point plan that the president put out there is very clear. It's supported not just by Israel, but by all of our Gulf Arab friends. It's that Hamas has to disarm. It's that Hamas has to actually behave itself, and that Hamas, while all the fighters can be given some sort of clemency, they're not going to be able to kill each other, and they're not going to be able to kill their fellow Palestinians. Now, again, that's going to take a little bit of time. We're talking about how to set up the security and humanitarian apparatus to put all this in place. But right now, where I stand, I feel confident that we're going to be in a place where this peace lasts, where it's durable. And if Hamas doesn't cooperate, then as the President of the United States has said, Hamas is going to be obliterated.
That was Vice President J.D. Vance speaking in Kiryat Gat, Israel, on Tuesday late afternoon. Vance had arrived in Israel earlier that day, and he departs later today, Thursday, October 23rd. His whirlwind visit has been jam-packed and overlapped for about a day with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. It's also been a really, really important visit strategically, diplomatically, and candidly to boost the political standing of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu domestically. I get into all of that and more today with Jonathan Conricus. We spoke yesterday, Wednesday, October 22nd. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Wednesday, October 22nd. Always good to see you, Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves, Jonathan Conricus. Thank you, as always, for making time for State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you, Vivian. As always, a pleasure to have the ability to be here.
Indeed. And we're going to try to do a really quick overview of the events that have transpired in this busy little country over the last week or so. Never a shortage of content or things to discuss. But I just want to very briefly kind of set the table for this discussion. Today's Wednesday. It was a week ago, Monday, so 10 days-ish, that the 20 living hostages were released from Hamas captivity. A day that we had both, and so many in Israel and around the world, had yearned for and seemed like it might never come. That was an incredible day, and it was highs and lows. And then almost immediately, as Israel began to withdraw from very limited parts of the Gaza Strip, where it had controlled the situation militarily, things deteriorated quickly and dangerously. We are just over a week later. In the interim, there has been significant speculation about the possible friction that may be setting in between Jerusalem and the White House. And maybe that was the reason for the very last-minute visit by Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, a few days ago, who were joined yesterday by J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. So that's the table. What I'd like you to do is, as always, the impossible, and go back to Monday, the day of mixed euphoria and boundless grief, because at the time we only received 4 out of 28 bodies from Hamas of dead Israelis and other nationalities, including one Nepali. And since then, as Trump would say, they've been providing or sending bodies of those who were murdered in captivity and on October 7th in dribs and drabs. And that has been a very significant snag, among other things. But that's all to say that Monday was a day of extremes, the hostage release day, and the extremes continue. So over to you, Lieutenant Colonel.
So let's unpack. The military situation is that Israel is controlling about 53% of the Gaza Strip, obviously from the Israeli border inwards towards Gaza, not including the biggest parts of Gaza City, but including most of Khan Yunis and Rafah, which is important. And that is where the future lays in Gaza, and I'll come to that in a second. Hamas is violating the agreement on many parts of it. Number one, they have not yet returned all of the bodies of the murdered hostages. We currently have 13 bodies left in Hamas captivity. Now, to disambiguate, it was clear from the beginning that indeed Hamas didn't have their hands on all of the bodies when the agreement was made, and that was acknowledged by Israel. That's why Minister Dermer, the wording that they agreed on was that, 72 hours for all of the live hostages and the murdered hostages to be returned. But the second sentence was that there will also be this system, this joint task force of intel with Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, Israel, the US, and Hamas to pool intelligence in order for the other hostages to be found, the bodies to be found, and then returned to Israel. Now, the problem is that Hamas has taken that little wiggle room and expanded it significantly. And what we have is Hamas using delaying tactics and only returning in dribs and drabs, as you said. But the purpose here is to delay the implementation of the deal. We're still in phase one. Israel so far has, in blunt terms, been told and ordered by the US not to respond and not to really rock the boat. Israel wanted to rock the boat, to close the Rafah crossing, to severely limit the flow of trucks with aid into Gaza, and to do other things. But Israel has been prevented very bluntly by the US of doing that. Another Hamas violation is tactical attacks. We have Hamas operatives attacking Israeli troops across the Gaza Strip, so not one incident in one location where Hamas could claim that, mistake, we didn't know, blah, 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 but several different incidents of direct and planned attacks against Israeli forces in Rafah and in the northern part of Gaza, leading to Israeli casualties. 3 days ago, 2 Israeli soldiers were killed, 4 more were wounded. Yesterday, an Israeli tank was targeted with an underbelly charge, and 3 Israeli soldiers were severely wounded. As we can see, significant violations of Hamas that is happening on the Israeli side of the yellow line. So in the area of Gaza that Israel, as per the agreement, is entitled to stay in. So that's violation number 2. Violation number 3, very significant for the current situation and the future. Hamas refuses to disarm, and they're saying it very clearly. They're demonstrating it in Arabic and in English, and they're saying we are only going to hand over our weapons to a Palestinian state. And that's a nice kind of Gordian knot, because the Palestinian state is far in the future, if at all. And for Hamas to tie them disarming to that is not in the agreement. It's a violation. And of course, it makes it pretty impossible to see it happen. Fourth and last is the brutal executions and activity that Hamas has been undertaking against Palestinians in Gaza. They are settling scores with a vengeance. They're executing. The last few days a little bit less, and they saw a lot of pushback in Israel, and they heard the vice president and the president speak about it, so they're perhaps doing it a little bit less. But what they are, settling scores and seeking to reestablish dominance and deterrence in Gazan society. We're talking about around between 15 and 20 Palestinians that were executed cold blood in the streets, publicly shown, humiliated, and of course abused and tortured before. And there's lots of videos, many of them have been authenticated on the ground coming from Gaza, where you see Hamas thugs breaking limbs, breaking legs, and just beating and humiliating, dragging corpses along the streets, and some pretty gory Hamas style of violence. So those are 4 main violations that Hamas is doing. Israel is being told, stand down, keep the show going, smile and wave, because we, the Americans, want to see this deal advance, and we're not going to let this level of violation by Hamas infringe. Now, where it becomes even more interesting is that the international security force is taking a lot of time to even find structure and really, a kind of a spine. and then flesh on the bones, meat on the bones here, because it is happening, but we see the early signs. The two main state supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar and Turkey, are invited to the party, and they will be part of that force. Egypt will be part of it, and the Palestinian Authority will be part of it. America will supervise it, and Israel will eventually have some kind of say about what they do and what they don't. But it's still unclear who will actually send soldiers. And, I've seen this from many things in the past when I dealt with UN peacekeeping. Many countries are happy to send staff officers and people that, will coordinate and do things in safe environments, some air-conditioned headquarters, but actually send troops that will be on the ground in sweaty, tense, dangerous situations, not so eager. And that's what we're seeing. And I think that reality here will defeat diplomacy. And I think that what the Egyptians have done is that they have prepped, trained, and equipped a Palestinian police force, which probably, even though that is not currently what's being said, they will probably form an important part of that international stabilization force. Now, if we break it down into different camps, there's the Muslim Brotherhood camp, which of course is Hamas on the ground, but supported by two nation states, Qatar and Turkey. And then there's what you would call moderate Sunni states, or the anti-Muslim Brotherhood, represented by Egypt and financially by Saudi Arabia. Now, Israel has to choose here. Either you take a very bad option, and that is to allow Muslim Brotherhood states a stake and say, and basically a seat at the table in shaping the future of the Gaza Strip, embodied by Qatar and Turkey, or you swallow a very sour and nasty pill, which is Palestinian Authority, because Egypt and Saudi, they are rooting for and they are paving the way for the return of the Palestinian Authority, whether it's the Rafah crossing or the police force that the Egyptians, ahead of time with foresight and good strategic planning, have trained and made available, and they are ready to be deployed. And Israel has to choose. It's either this very bad option or this bad option. Strategy is always a choice between imperfect choices. And I think it should be pretty clear for Israel what it needs to do. I think giving keys and an entrance ticket to Turkey and Qatar further, Qatar has been around, for a long time, providing money and having lots of influence at the invitation of this Israeli prime minister, this Israeli and previous Israeli government. I don't think it would be wise to allow them further expansion of their influence. And on the other hand, politically speaking, this prime minister, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, has said and campaigned on that there won't be a Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Now, something has to give. My fear is, as an Israeli, is that a political commitment to the base in Israel will outweigh the long-term strategic threat to Israel, and that this government will prefer Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, everything included, Hamas, Qatar, and Turkey, over the more moderate Arab axis of Egypt and Saudi Arabia that are bedfellows with the Palestinian Authority. That's currently my concern. Now, if you want to go, and I'll say a few words about the visit of the vice president.
Before we do that, can I please interrupt for a moment? Because you made a comment, and I'd like you to address this as you comment on the vice president's visit yesterday. One is, you stated unequivocally that we are still in phase one of the agreement, the peace agreement, because of the 4 violations that you outlined that on the part of Hamas. America has been very clear in saying we're actually moving on to phase 2, to stage 2. So I'd like you to just clarify that, because that is a point of contention, I think, between Israel and America. And the other thing is, just to clarify, I believe it's in point number 20, 21 was dropped, of the agreement, that is very equivocal in stating, if we get through all of these other points and we're successful, then maybe we will sit down and consider talking about a Palestinian state, but not 4. And that seems to have gotten lost in a lot of the static around in this being kind of discussed in the last 10 days. So Back to you, please. Vice
Yeah.
President, will try to address my comments, questions.
Yep. So it's basically a reality distortion field. Okay, reality is pretty clear. We're in stage one. Hamas is violating it, and they're very far, and they're not behaving like an organization that is readying to disarm and hand over power peacefully. That's very clear. And if anybody would, take off political glasses and just look at the situation, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We're still in stage one. Israel is implementing it. It's on its side of the yellow line. Hamas is not. Now, reality distortion fields, they're powerful. They can be used, but eventually reality is stronger, and those fields stretch and then they break. What's interesting with the visit here of the vice president is, I think, an important outcome from an Israeli perspective will be, okay, Mr. Vice President, first and foremost, we in Israel are very happy that you're here. I think it's a strategically important visit, long-term speaking, because this is an American vice president who probably is going to be around the top echelons of American power for a long time ahead. Many people who know more about American politics indicate that this is a future presidential candidate. And I think his strategic education, if we could use that word, is very important here. And this is a vice president who I think has a different kind of approach to what Israel is, how important Israel is for American foreign policy and projection of force capacity in the Middle East. And I've been monitoring, his statements from before campaigning, and then in office. And I have to say that I think the vice president is learning a lot about the realities of the Middle East and what a tremendous, loyal, and valuable ally the state of Israel is for the projection of American force. So we have immediate things that are going to be discussed with the vice president. But when I zoom out and look at how important this visit is in terms of who the person is, I think Israeli leaders and military officials will kind of want to impress upon him the bigger picture here and the long-term picture of U.S.-Israeli relations. Now, there's full court pressure. Kushner and Witkoff, unprecedented, very unorthodox direct meeting with two Israeli generals, the head of ops and the head of planning. Sorry, the head of intel and the head of planning. Very highly unusual. I cannot stress that enough, that there's a direct meeting between a foreign politician, appointed official, and direct meeting with Israeli generals at the operational level without the involvement of a government representative. It's a different thing if you have the prime minister or defense minister in the room and two Israeli officers are told to come and brief and share details, but this is a different ballgame, and I am not very happy about it. I prefer that U.S. Army and military officials speak with their Israeli military counterparts, political military, without Israeli elected officials in between. It smells strange, and there's a lot of things that need to be explained there. But there's full court American pressure with the very obvious message: do not stall the deal, do not disrupt the things that are painful for Hamas, and keep the deal in effect and keep it running. Now, so far, Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to contain that situation within his coalition. The usual culprits of instability for whatever reason, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they've huffed and puffed and they've threatened a little bit, nothing significant, and I don't see them doing anything really disruptive because I think they know very clearly that Netanyahu doesn't have a choice. Israel is lacking diplomatic runway in the sense of other options. If we don't do what the Americans tell us to do, then there aren't many other options, and all of the other consequences would be pretty bad for Israel. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is where we're standing. I think that the last thing, what I think Israeli officials will be aspiring to get from Kushner and Witkoff, and perhaps with vice presidential support, some kind of time frame where it says, okay, we understand that this is a work in progress and it's difficult and dynamic, but please give us a time frame of how long we have to endure this reality distortion field until we can go back to calling a spade and saying, okay, Hamas is violating, we're now going to start to push back. And hopefully that will exist, because those are agreements that exist between the U.S. and Israel when it goes related to Lebanon, the ceasefire that we achieved there. Those are also understandings that exist regarding Syria, perhaps a little bit less formal and written, but they exist, and there are clear understandings what the reference is. Here, it appears that we are at odds. Let's say there's Israel and reality on one side, and then there's American aspirations on the other side, and they have to meet. And hopefully it'll be, in a relatively short time. Otherwise, Hamas, being clever and cunning as they are, they will exploit that, and they will draw things out, and they would make it impossible to really build a different future. Two last remarks. One, I've been watching Hamas communications and how they've been communicating strategically, messaging, video, etc. It's a bit messy. And it's not as tidy as it was before. And I think the undoing of Abu Ubaidah, the prolific Goebbels of Hamas, the guy who was in charge of messaging, psychological warfare, and strategic communications, you can see that. It looks to me, as someone who looks at the machinery behind it, it looks as if they are not as organized, as coherent, and they don't have the same kind of narrative control that they had in the past. They issue corrections and contradicting statements, and they're not fast on the ball. Interesting to follow. Last thing is about reconstruction. And I think this is an important leverage, whereby in the areas that Israel control, there's going to be early signs of reconstruction. So Rafah and Khan Yunis, that is where everybody will be looking for the situation to start to improve very slowly and with a lot of work, a lot of investment. That is where things are going to happen. Gaza City, which is controlled by Hamas, is not where things are going to happen. And that is a very important leverage moving forward in terms of the balance of power here with Hamas. The bottom line for the ordinary Palestinian is, if you want to be in a place where things are going to get better, then don't be where Hamas controls. Go to the area that is on the Israeli side of the yellow line.
So I want to I echo your comments that you made a few minutes ago about Vice President Vance and his learning curve with respect to the Middle East and the value of Israel. It's been remarkable. I too have been paying attention to him for almost a decade now, since he came out with his book, Hillbilly Elegy, and then he ran for senator. And it was very clear this guy is on a trajectory. So it's quite remarkable how he has assimilated the lessons of the Middle East in a very short period of time. Having said that, I want to also just focus for a moment again on your comment with respect to Witkoff and Jared Kushner meeting directly with top Israeli generals, and how extraordinary, not in a good way, that is. We know that this current White House kind of has its own rules with respect to how it approaches government and how it prefers to end run the bureaucracy, go around it, the deep state, which it's convinced is sabotaging all of its efforts. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that's how they approach things. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has similar feelings about the bureaucracy, and basically anyone who doesn't agree with him in Israel, that we too are members of deep state. But, this is when my inner lawyer comes out. When you look at, we have processes and we have separations of roles between the military and the civilian government for very good reasons, and chains of command. And it's when, in moments like this, when form is more than form, it's not just that we're ticking boxes and following procedures, it becomes substance. And here we have, as you point out, two very highly regarded, exceptionally talented and committed individuals, Witkoff and Jared, who are appointed. They're not even elected. They're appointed officials representing the White House directly. And they're sitting down directly with their non-counterparts, generals in the Israeli military. And as you point out, usually, always, you would have at least a civilian representative, maybe Minister Dermer, in the room at such a meeting.
Yeah, Minister Dermer, Minister Katz with the translator, or yeah.
So, this was not an oversight. Why do you think this happened?
I mean, I connect the dots. These Witkoff and Kushner were in the government the weekly meeting where they voted on the implementation of the ceasefire. And if you listen to their comments, I think they feel that the prime minister needs a lot of internal political support in order to carry this deal through. I think they've assessed in their very sharp political analysis that the weakness is the prime minister and his ability to actually carry this through. And that's why they were in the government meeting. That is why they were singing the praise of the prime minister and explaining to the ministers and allegedly to the Israeli public things that should be very obvious, that the prime minister is operating with the best interests of the country in mind, which shouldn't have to be said. That should be kind of an obvious thing. But nevertheless, that was the core message. And they were repeating how strong and patriotic and steadfast and clever negotiator and great leader the prime minister is. And, when people say good things about me that are obvious, I think, well, why is there a need to say it? Isn't it obvious? So it's a bit concerning. And I cannot make sense of the fact, because I know that the prime minister is of course, highly skilled and experienced politician, and he is not a person that lets go of control and allows things to slip. And for the prime minister not to have a trusted advisor or person in the room for such a meeting, for me, it looks very unusual. And there could be many reasons. The reason I give is that is what he was told that Witkoff and Kushner wanted. They wanted a direct meeting and to hear from generals who are apolitical, and they want to hear exactly how things stand without political interference. That's how I read it. It could be different reasons, could be, 100% different, that the prime minister has such tremendous confidence in the generals that he is happy for them to have meetings. It's totally okay to have meetings with appointed officials. Makes less sense to me. But bottom line, of course, going to have to continue to look into this and understand exactly what was said and why this came about. But as you said correctly, and perhaps this sums it up, the Trump administration has a different way of doing business. And currently, this different way of doing business is pretty much working. It has brought us so far. It has brought 20 live Israeli hostages home and 15 bodies of murdered Israeli hostages. And I think we should at least give it the credibility and, that it's been working and delivering. And I hope that it'll continue to deliver. And, if it delivers, then we can swallow deviations from protocol, even though you're a former ambassador and I worked in the military. I served in the military for many years, and we're kind of institutionalized to protocol in a certain sense. But if protocol doesn't serve a purpose, then no need to have it.
Very interesting. I want to just very quickly get you to comment on Vice President Vance's visit to this new center in Kiryat Gat. For the listeners and viewers, Kiryat Gat is a smallish town, 30,000 or so, in southern Israel, not far from where I live on a kibbutz, also in southern Israel. And I just have to share this little anecdote because it's kind of fun. As I was driving home yesterday from a day in Tel Aviv, and I was driving south on Highway 6, which is the main north-south artery in Israel, I noticed that the northbound lanes were closed, and huge presence of police. And then all of a sudden, as I'm actually listening to Vice President Vance's comments on the radio from the new center in Kiryat Gat, a convoy of 100+ police cars passes me in the other direction. The entire highway was closed, and Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner, and I assume many, many others were in that convoy. It was like, really? This is happening? As I'm listening to his comments. His comments, though, Vice President Vance made at this site were extraordinary. And he was clearly intending to diffuse any possibility or speculation that there's tension between Israel and America, between the governments. And what he said in a nutshell was this: yeah, we've run into snags, but we're dealing with a situation where we have longtime forsworn enemies who have been at each other's throats and at war, and we're sort of slowly working through untangling all the tangles. We're working through the Gordian knot, to use your metaphor from earlier in the discussion. And he said, frankly, I think we've done much better. I think we're much further along than I had anticipated. It's been a very strong beginning. And then he went on to explain why, in the context of this new center that I didn't know anything about until yesterday, you did. What's the center? What do you think of the vice president's observations to date?
I'll address it briefly. The center is basically a headquarters, which is supposed to be the nucleus of the International Stabilization Force and the overseeing mechanism, one of the places where decisions will be made and the execution of the aftermath of the peace deal will be conducted from. Another center will be Cairo, Sharm el-Sheikh, where official meetings are being held, led by the Egyptians. But in terms of where things are supposed to be coordinated on the ground from the Israeli side, is Kiryat Gat. Now, one could ask, well, I mean, there's lots of military bases in Israel, and there are military bases where the Americans already have a permanent presence. For instance, in Tel Nof, which is an air base also in southern Israel, not so far from the Gaza Strip. There are many joint exercises there, and would make sense to have the command center there inside a closed military facility, controlled environment where the Americans already have a presence. And the reason why that's not happening is because of the Muslim Brotherhood. Two countries that are, at least we can call them hostile or unfriendly. One is on the way of becoming an enemy state, and that's Turkey. These two countries, Qatar and Turkey, are going to be represented on the ground. Egypt will probably also have representatives on the ground, and Israel wasn't inclined to have all of these people and others inside an Israeli Air Force base. So that's why a civilian building was leased, and it's going to be working from there. I think it's odd, but it's an acceptable decision. And what's going to happen is that is where things are going to be run from. And it's going to be interesting. Military, or obviously IDF, is involved, and there's a two-star general who is heading the coordination efforts, part of the international coordination unit, heading the coordination efforts with the relevant parties. And it'll be very interesting to see how fast it grows. And I think crucial for what Vice President Vance spoke about, like getting over snags, well, really important to stand up this force as quickly as possible, because as long as it doesn't stand up, then Hamas will be quite justified in saying, well, who do you want me to hand over my weapons to if there isn't a force with teeth, boots on the ground, that is going to uphold law and order, prevent anarchy, and also provide some semblance of protection for former Hamas? Then Hamas are not going to hand over their weapons. If I'm a Hamas guy and I've been terrorizing, brutalizing, killing, oppressing other Palestinians, various clans have an axe to grind with me, of course I will not relinquish my military power before I know that it's relatively safe to do so. And in general, I will think long and hard before doing it if I'm a Hamas terrorist or Hamas commander. So one thing has to happen before the other. And I think here, to be honest and truthful about it, I don't think that you can really expect Hamas to disarm before this international security force is starting to be implemented, because otherwise there will be chaos, anarchy, chaos, and that's not what anybody wants. Wouldn't serve any purposes except for perhaps a few extremist factions. So this needs to happen fast, and it needs to be deployed quickly, communicated quickly, and then pressure applied on Hamas and say, okay, these are now the guys that are going to take over. You are now to implement the deal, lay down your weapons, vacate the centers of power and control over Gaza. Israeli troops will withdraw further. The ISF, International Stabilization Force, will expand its control and holding. More aid will come in. Reconstruction will start, or first taking out the tremendous amounts of rubble, and then reconstruction. But things have to happen all at once, but they have to happen in certain logical succession. And before ISF is established, I don't see Hamas relinquishing weapons.
Yeah, unfortunately, you commented earlier in our discussion that you think that in the end, reality will probably prevail over diplomacy and diplomatic efforts. And I think it's a good time to remind our listeners of that kind of dire prediction, because what that means likely is that it will be the IDF that will have to go back in and do the very dirty work of disarming Hamas. President Trump has made it very clear that he would support such an action if Hamas does not surrender its arms willingly. And I tend to agree with you that I think that's totally not happening, which brings Qatar much more into the frame, in my view, even more so than Turkey, because Qatar is the controller of Hamas. They're the financier. They give them diplomatic cover. They give them a safe haven. And Qatar's got to pick a team. And it's either Team Muslim Brotherhood or Team Western Liberalism Democracy / USA. I understand there's quite a bit of tension within the Qatari kind of ruling club, if I can call it that, between the actual family that
Also within the family.
and the prime minister. But we'll leave that for another day because we just can't do it all, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivian.
Before I let you go, do you have a quick word for Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, who felt that this was the time he needed to come out and assert unequivocally that should Prime Minister Netanyahu, choose to set foot on Canadian soil, that he would certainly be arrested by Canadian authorities pursuant to the International Criminal Court arrest warrants? Carney made that comment last Thursday to Bloomberg News. And there's been strong response. It continues from the Prime Minister's office here yesterday, basically saying, you might want to reconsider that, Prime Minister Carney. So far, silence from Canada. Any thoughts?
A weak leader that succumbs to fake information and a biased narrative against Israel. The allegations of genocide and crimes against humanity waged against Israel are false, unfounded, have no standing, no connection to reality. And I think any leader with critical thinking, what's expected of any leader would be to say, you know what, I call BS. The people in the ICC who made those allegations, the prosecutor is corrupt. The people have strong, continued, documented political bias against Israel. And I'm not going to play for it. I'm not going to stand and say this is okay, especially as lie after lie is being fact-checked and unraveled. The famine allegations were a complete lie. Famine was announced by UN-affiliated organizations on the 22nd of August. And according to UN numbers, and I won't go into too much details, if you want to see the details, there's an expert called Eisenberg on Twitter, and he does all the number crunching. I just repeat what he says after I check. And it basically, if those allegations were true, from the 22nd of August and until the ceasefire, there should have been more than 10,000 direct deaths of starvation. You know how many there actually were? 192. According to Hamas figures, which we should always take with a grain of salt, and many of them are false, but let's say that they are correct, that's a 98% difference between UN official declarations that were parroted by leaders and media and weak people around the world because it served the narrative against Israel, and reality, which is that, yeah, some people died, but there's no starvation in Gaza. Hardship, inconvenience, fear, trauma, yes, but no starvation. So that was a lie. The genocide libel is a lie. It doesn't stand the test of any assessment and any verification. And what I would expect the leader of a democracy to do is to have the backbone and another body part to say, well, I won't stand for this. And definitely not go ahead and, chirp and say that, oh yeah, we're going to arrest the prime minister of Israel because there's an outstanding warrant for him. I think it's, An excellent example of betting on a wrong horse, poor leadership, weak leadership, populism, and something that I think is a stain on Canada.
Terrible stain on Canada. And I know that domestic Canadian politics and Canadian foreign policy are not your beat, but they're kind of mine. And it's also just an unbelievably stupid thing to say and do in the midst of these very contentious tariff negotiations with President Trump. And I can't imagine that he's going to be overlooking that comment because it clearly places Canada in a very different camp. But that's for another day and another expert again. So we'll check in with you hopefully in a few weeks. And I mean, here we're all on tenterhooks. Looking forward with very cautious optimism, would you agree? But a sense of strong reality and pragmatism.
Indeed. Well said.
Thank you, Jonathan Conricus, as always.
Thank you, Vivian.
I'm recording this on Thursday, October 23rd, midday in Israel, and I just received a breaking news bulletin that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are in Saudi Arabia. Their proposal made to the Saudis to participate in the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip while Hamas keeps its weapons and control has been declined by the Saudis. Frankly, I don't blame them. The Saudi position is, reportedly, that without accelerating the involvement of the Palestinian Authority, there will be no progress. In light of what we just heard from Jonathan Conricus, this would seem to move us closer to Israel either going into the Strip to disarm Hamas by force or allowing the Palestinian Authority to do so, which, frankly, is just not a realistic proposition. So stay tuned. Things here move very quickly, more quickly than lightning speed. Thank you to State of Tel Aviv and Beyond subscribers and followers. Please take a moment, review us on your preferred podcast platform or YouTube or everywhere. Rate us, comment, show us some love. It all helps to boost our profile and play to the algorithm. So if you appreciated the last half hour plus, take a moment to share your thoughts. Thanks, as always, for being here. And until next time, stay safe. We love hearing from you. So please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.